Councillor Greg Sayers, and that will be dealt with under item 10, which we will now move to. I thought possibly the best way of doing this, Councillor Sayers, is to get you to formally move the motion. We'll seek a seconder. You might like to speak to it, but I would also like our officers then to pass their comments following your introduction. But it is a notice of motion from you, and it's appropriate, I think, that you have the first bite of the cherry, particularly given this season. Right, so Councillor Sayers, do we have a seconder for the motion? Councillor John Watson. Councillor Sayers, the floor is yours.
Mr Mayor, could I then, once the officers are presented, do I get a right of reply at the end of that?
Yeah, as the mover of the notice of motion, you have a right of reply at the end of the debate.
Thank you, Mr.
That's there, and you have the right to ask questions as well.
All right, thank you. There is a PowerPoint presentation that I think would be helpful. So today what's been presented in this notice of motion is that in February we looked at the electoral reviews processes and kind of locked ourselves into not doing anything until 2025 elections. What I'm asking today in the notice of motion is we revoke that decision and look at carrying out this Rodney subdivision boundary review in time for the 2022 elections. Mr Foster's given a general overview. He didn't have a lot of time. I'll elaborate on the model a little bit more for the members. But so today's request isn't necessarily about endorsing a model, it's endorsing going out for public consultation and getting that feedback. The Rodney Local Board area has very distinct rural and urban areas, and we have a duty of care to ensure that there is always fair, strong, balanced and equitable representation at all times. What this group has unearthed since February is a model based not on geographical area, as we see on the left, but more on communities of interest. The key consideration, I think, for us around the table today is whether there's sufficient grounds for the proposal to warrant undertaking such a review. Council can't undertake a partial review, would have to go out to all of Auckland to ask for input, and we may well get comments from other areas of Auckland as well about their areas of representation, and we'd have to duly consider those in the proper manner. So what that slide up there is showing is if you look up on the right-hand corner of the second slide, there's kind of the Warkworth boundary. That includes Matakana, Lee, Algies, Warkworth. Now that's an area that you'll see is much tighter than the brown on the left-hand side. That area there has a structure plan in place for it. The boundaries more closely represent the actual urban parameters of that area. The structure plan's in there to take care of growth that's coming into that area, and that community up there is very focused on that growth and how they deal with that growth going forward. We go down to the pink area at Dairy Flat. Again, there's a structure plans in place for that community. They're having growth, industrial and residential coming into that district, so that community is very focused on the needs there. We go to the yellow, the Kimu. Again, the proposed boundary more tightly aligns with the perimeter of the township and that area. That area does not have a structure plan in place. It has had 2,500 houses through special housing areas dumped in there with no thought to infrastructure, particularly around roading. So they have horrendous congestion of traffic, particularly along State Highway 16, and that community is very concerned about that, and they will be focusing as a community about how they deal with that, with no plans to deal with it for the next 10 years. Then you've got that large green area, which represents a rural area. About 50% of the rate take comes from the rural community. Those farmers may typically pay $50,000, $40,000, $20,000 a year in their rates, and their common interest is where's our value for money in that. We don't get footpaths, we don't get sewage, we don't get wastewater, we don't get fresh water. All we've got is an unsealed roading network that we'd like to have addressed. So that community tends to focus on that, and there's the commonality between the different those different communities. So really what I see is this proposal really gives those townships tighter electoral representation to help focus on the needs of those areas. And so it's not just about the townships, it's also about the rural. And it's not just about the rural, it's also about representation in those townships. So this new idea that's been proposed is about giving each of those 4 areas with different common interests, areas of common interests, rather than a geographical-based approach, more of a tighter, fairer and more equitable approach to their areas of concern. So if I go on to the next slide, Sandra, thank you. So what's been proposed in terms of, I'll start off by saying, just addressing the point that this is not about any type of criticism of local board performance, decision-making or even funding mechanisms that are in place. This proposal is not about how much money the LTP would be putting into the roading networks. The total number of elected members remain at 9. They're just spread out differently, as you can see up there. And as you appreciate, and as the Chair, Phelan Perry, alluded to, once elected into office, those local board members try and govern collectively across the entire local board area. But what this does is really take home for those elected members their duties and responsibilities to those areas from where they come. So just to be clear, and I want to reinforce the point that was made in the presentation by Mr. Foster, that at the moment on that left-hand side, the quotas aren't being met. The new model on the right-hand side, and supported by the number crunching in the paper that you've been presented by the NAIG group, complies. And I think that's a very important point to make. And it addresses Councillor Darby's concerns, I think, around the proposal as well. There's 11% Māori across Rodney. Now, whether this eventuates or not, but you could say potentially Māori identify with rural more than they do with urban. And there would be a hope there that with 4 rural seats that candidates supported by iwi or individual candidates may well consider running for office. I would just say that the notice of motion was received by the Chief Executive on the 6th of November, and that was distributed on the same date to all local board members. So I know there have been a number of workshops and business meetings since then, but obviously this hasn't been discussed. But I think, as mentioned, there should be opportunity for the local board to contribute to this should it go out for public consultation. And just onto the last slide, if I may. This is the resolution that we actually all voted on back in February. I've just highlighted 3 points there. The electoral system circled there in C, that's something that we're not looking at today, but Councillor Darby has alluded and kind of supported by the Chair that maybe there's opportunity to do that. I'd be reluctant to move a motion around that to lose my speaking rights, but the F there is really, I just highlighted, we did identify that there was an opportunity to review representation, but then we went on to G and said we'd take no further action for the 2022 elections, and it's G that I'm looking to revoke. So just to conclude, there were a couple of papers sent around by the 2 local MPs for the area, but one from Labour, Maya Lubrick, and one from the National Party, Chris Pink, which is kind of unusual that they would unite in this. But what they were basically saying in their letters was we should take this opportunity to undertake a review and let the public have input. So I thank those Ministers of Parliament for doing that. And just to conclude, what I'm asking for is for us collectively to exercise our duty of care to go to the people of Ronnie. At the heart of this is the people, not the elected representatives, to see if they believe that such a model gives them better representation for both the townships and for the rural areas. It's about expressing a democratic right to have a fair, balanced and equitable model in place for them now. And that's why we're saying the timing's now. Now we know about this, we should go out and execute our carer duty and go out to public consultation. I think I'll conclude there, Mr Mayor, other than to say, when I first looked at this proposal, I saw advantages for the rural areas, and I saw advantages for the people of Rodney to actually have a say about how they would like their electoral representation presented, and I also saw an opportunity for us to get back into quota and meet the criteria rather than stay outside the boundaries. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. The way in which I intend to proceed now, I'd like to invite Rose Leonard and Warwick McNaughton to come to the table, please. Also to acknowledge that we have here Brian Osborne, our Senior Statistical Analyst at REMU, Leslie Jenkins, the Local Area Manager for Hibiscus and Bays, Rodney and Upper Harbour, and I think we have somebody here from Auckland Transport, is that correct? Maybe not. Okay. How I'd like to proceed is to get Warwick and Rose to provide a background, a context for the notice of motion. I'll then, I think, divide it up into having questions to our council officers and then a chance for comment. So, and at the end of that comment, Councillor says you'll have a right of reply. Warwick, I think you're leading off, or yeah.
Thank you, Your Worship and Councillors. In the advice that I distributed, the written advice acknowledged the background paper, very thorough, very innovative, and as well as that, it achieves compliance with the 10% rule. So congratulations there. The key comment I was going to make was that it's not possible to conduct a partial review in the way the notice of motion is worded, but Councillor Sayers, I think, has accepted that. So I attached to my advice the full section 19.8H from the Local Electoral Act, which sets out everything that has to be determined. Essentially, a review is a review of all of the representation arrangements for the coming election. We cannot leave any matters undetermined, but in conducting a review, we might decide that all arrangements are status quo or only a few of the arrangements are changed. But they're all publicly notified and the public can submit on any aspect. And if there are any appeals, the Local Government Commission can consider and change any of the Council's proposals. At a minimum, we would need to address the current non-compliance with the 10% rule, which exists in the Rodney Ward and Howick Local Board subdivisions. And other issues may arise during consultation. So that's really just to say it's bigger than just deciding to review the Rodney Local Board subdivision boundaries. In terms of whether or not it's worth doing it now and then deferring the following review to 2028, there are signals from government that there will be legislative reform in the local government area during this term of Parliament. And so my guess is that you would want to do another review in 2025. And the final comment is just to make the observation, I'm not saying whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it hasn't been made already, is that one consequence of the proposed rural subdivision relates to the way population is spread. So approximately 70% of the population will be in the southern part of the rural subdivision and 30% in the top part. What that means for voters in the Wellsford area is that a good thing. They'll be able to elect 4 representatives, but the voting population is in the south, and those representatives will likely be determined by the voters in the south. And again, I'm saying that it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but I want to make that observation, and that's why we tend to look at place-based subdivisions to ensure there's an even geographical spread. At the moment, people in the Wellsford area have a guarantee that they can elect one person onto the board.
Thank you very much, Warwick. So we come now to questions. So we'll just, first of all, I'll start with Councillor Shane Henderson.
Thanks, Mayor. Sorry, I haven't had much sleep courtesy of a 1-year-old, so I just need to check my understanding on this. Does this mean that passing this notice of motion would allow a review of other boundaries in different wards?
Oh, most definitely. That's what I'm saying. It's a full review.
And would that also include Māori wards, or is it specifically for geographic lines?
No, it doesn't include Māori wards. There's separate legislation around Māori wards. The cut-off date for that was 23rd of November last year. Sorry, this year.
Thank you. Councillor Linda Cooper.
Mine was just the wording. Councillor Henderson said allow. Is it more likely that it requires a full review if we do one ward?
We have to determine all the representation arrangements for the next elections.
If we open it up, everything.
Although
would
we
have-
might end up deciding that we don't change very little.
Yes, but we'd have to go through the whole process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't have any other questions. I do. Councillor Daniel Newman.
Thank you and good morning. My issue is has actually probably been addressed by you, but the wording at C is a little unhelpful for me, because if we were to have a review, I would presume that we'd have to do a full options analysis, including within the Rodney Local Board area, which would consider options beyond the proposal put up by the Northern Action Group, wouldn't it? It would, all options would be on the table, including the option of election at large.
Yes, and it's been our practice in the past to get feedback from local boards, so any options that they might want to put on the table as well.
Thank you very much. Councillor Angela Dalton.
Thank you. My question is around the resourcing to do it in terms of time. So the Joint Governance Working Party have an existing work plan, so with some hefty pieces of work in it. And I am wondering how much it will be compromised. You've got in the report that, as an example, the Code of Conduct would have to be deferred, which is worrying. There's other pieces of work, I would say, the review of the local board funding that we're currently going through. How long would this review take? When would you, if this was passed, when would you need to start the piece of work, and how long would it take?
Yes. The first public notification of the council's initial proposal would need to be about August. I think it was July last time we did it. The deadline is for the notification to be early September, I think. So we need a whole process in front of that to engage you people and local board people about potential changes and to get agreement on what ought to be the council's initial proposal.
Thank you. Councillor Chris Darby.
Thanks, Mayor. Warwick, I've become aware of a briefing note to the incoming minister that signals a review of, I think the words are governance arrangements in Auckland. Do you think there is greater potential, in respect to the mover of this motion, to actually do this more thoroughly and work with government, Auckland Council working with government, because I've signalled local government reforms generally, and I've specifically signalled a review of the Auckland legislation in that briefing note. Do you think there's scope to capture what Councillor Sayers is intending here, along with other matters that have come to our attention, and possibly things that we're not quite aware of? If we drew up a scope, we get the Chief Executive to come back with a scope of how to work with government on this.
Yeah, through the Chair, I'm aware of various statements about looking at reforms of local government. So earlier on there were intentions to modernise legislation around local elections, for example. There's moves for local elections to go to the Electoral Commission. In terms of the statement and the briefing to the incoming minister about Auckland governance, I took that to read as a response to the continuing submissions that we make to them to increase the number of councillors. At the moment, the legislation sets the number of councillors at 20. Every other council can include in their review of representation arrangements how many councillors to have. I'm also aware that LGNZ are starting to look at issues wider than just localism, but reform, but mainly around Three Waters and RMA. There are a number of reform pieces of work on the horizon that may well engage us next year.
Just a supplementary, if you don't mind, Mayor. A wise government, I'm not suggesting they're otherwise, wouldn't it be interested in legislative change that established Auckland and to look at it in review to help inform itself in the drafting of future legislation that might affect local government reorganisation in other parts of the country? Do you think they'd be, was that far too generous of me to the Parliament?
Very soon after what's called the Super City was formed, there was a review undertaken by the Auditor General's Office, and then there was a further review sometime later, 5 years, undertaken by the Committee for Auckland, or sponsored by the Committee for Auckland. It was actually undertaken by Professor Ian Shirley. And there's possibly an argument for another review. I have heard various submissions and arguments for different sorts of review. I think one of the key requests at the moment is for review of funding opportunities.
Thank you very much. Just in clarification of that, there is in the briefing for the incoming minister from the Department of Internal Affairs the suggestion of a review of Auckland's governance arrangements. But I took that, I haven't read it firsthand, I've read it through the media, but I took that to be relatively limited in terms of removing the restriction on us that is imposed only on Auckland and not other councils for determining the size of our membership, which we all know was a barrier to even considering the creation of a Māori ward. And secondly, there would be changes that the Minister has signalled about making it easier to implement Māori wards without going to referendum. Was there anything, are you familiar with the briefing, was there anything that suggested the review of Auckland's governance arrangements would be wider than that? No. Okay, thank you. Last question, Councillor Desley Simpson.
Thanks, Your Worship. Warwick, what would be the cost of this if it was to be successful?
The cost of a review, look, it would, in dollar terms, it would be less than $100,000 probably. The bigger impact is really on staff time and resources. And as I've signalled, there's possibly a program of work coming through from central government that we might wish to engage on. Yep.
Thank you very much. We come now for comments. So those wishing to comment on the notice of motion, maybe Councillor John Watson, if you as the seconder, you'd like to comment on it at this point. And anybody else wishing to comment, please indicate to us that you'd like to talk to it.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for volunteering me to go first up. Appreciate that.
I had no other speaker on the list, John. You had to be it.
Well, yeah. So I guess just at the outset, I'd like to thank Councillor Sayers for bringing this matter to our attention, and particularly in his and others' quest to try and ensure some sort of fair, strong, equitable representation that reflects the communities of interest. And I think it's very important to bear in mind how unique the Rodney ward is from other parts of Auckland, not just in terms of its size and its diversity of geography, but also in those communities of interest which a representation's meant to reflect. But what's perhaps not quite so apparent in that analysis of the rather unique features of Rodney is its political heritage, which is very much playing out now in a manner that's almost reflective of the last century. And that might not be immediately apparent to people that sit around this table, or indeed the organisation as a whole. For some of us who served on the Rodney District Council, it certainly is. It was first and foremost a consideration in terms of both how the council operated and how its communities regarded that council. And at its probably at its height, this political heritage achieved kind of national infamy, really, in terms of the fact that it was dissolved. So in 2000, the Rodney District Council was dissolved, a commissioner was put in, and that was largely a consequence, despite being personal factors, but it was largely reflective of this urban-rural conflict or divide, or however you might like to frame it. Ironically enough, back then, and indeed in the years since then, it was the urban part of Rodney who felt they were getting the bum deal. So basically you had a situation where collectively the rural councillors outnumbered the Hibiscus Coast, the urban councillors, and they were not beyond using that to their advantage. The irony now is that while perhaps not cast in that same rural-urban conflict, and certainly nothing approaching some of the scenes that characterise the Rodney District Council, there is that feeling of discontent, of not getting a fair shake of the salve, or have a suck of the salve. I'm mixing up my metaphors there. And that's been around since the inception of the super city. We know that with the Northern Action Group, who have at various times attempted to break away, and they're doing that not in a vacuum. They're doing that reflecting some fairly heartfelt sentiments that become stronger the further north you go, north of the bridge, in fact. So the further you go up, at the level of dissatisfaction with what has emerged through the super city becomes stronger, and that's just a fact, and it's reflected in all our surveys that we do. And ironically enough, also at election time, where those very same communities often have a higher voter turnout. So these are people who are politically engaged. They do have basic expectations of how they should be represented and what they might reasonably expect from that representation. Now, at Rodney, it's very clear those expectations are not being met. Councillor Sayers, as the councillor on the ground, is very much aware of those, and it's to his credit that he's attempting to address that in a way that at least gives people the opportunity to consider doing things differently. Now, as was said at the outset, that might not well be adopted, that might be rejected categorically. But I think it's important in terms of that wider political context to give people the opportunity to feed into that, because this feeling of discontent, which is not reflective of individuals, as Councillor is saying, it's just what's been imposed, and I think it would be wise to give that opportunity as a very coherent submission that has been made to us. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with all parts of it, but I think it should be put out to the people who are better placed to make a more of an informed judgment as to how this might improve that situation. The alternative is to do nothing, and this discontent continues to fester, and that is in no one's interest. So I think Councillor Sayers' notice of motion provides a way forward, that a review of that subdivision boundaries might strike a sweet spot that goes towards perhaps addressing some of these inherent political dissatisfaction that exist and have been around for a while. So thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that opportunity, and on that basis I'll be supporting the notice of motion.
Thank you very much. Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and thanks, Greg, for this work. It's interesting. I'm not saying it's perfect, and what this is about is not what the proposal is, but whether we go out for public input on it, which means we have to open up the can of worms for the whole city. And I was involved in the last one, and it is a substantial piece of work. It is heavy, intensive stuff to get through. It's not easy. So, Mr. Mayor, I don't have a problem with what's been proposed here by the Northern Action Group. It's the timing that I think is difficult. It's already been mentioned twice today, and I'll say for the third time, I think it's important. There's a lot of uncertainty around what is going to be on the government's agenda for local government over the next 3 years, and that may well affect boundaries or representation levels. We need to wait and see what that that occurs before we launch into something that may end up being redundant before it even gets started. So I suggest we follow our normal procedures, that we wait to 2025 and instigate the review then in a thorough, timed manner with an allocated budget that does justice, and we do it for the whole of Auckland as we did last time, and made it rounded and balanced, because one ward is not an island unto itself. There are changes within those ward boundaries for subdivisions, but there are also changes to ward boundaries drawn out by our experience of the last review. So not against the proposal, but Mr Mayor, I think it's all about the timing, so I will not be supporting.
Thank you. Councillor Pipacoom.
Tēnā koe e te koro matua, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou e te kaupapa e tēnā wā. I was just going to vote against this, but I think I owe it to the Councillor Sayers, Mr Mayor, and those who've worked on this proposal, just to say a few words about why I won't be supporting this at this time. And I do want to acknowledge the work that's gone into it, but I do find the timing is very curious when we have a huge pipeline of work coming at us and for staff going into the LTP next year. And the way it will open up a review of all of the issues on local boards means that it would put a huge amount of work onto staff. And I just want to make a note that in terms of subdivisions, there's actually quite a strong argument to not have subdivisions at all on local boards. And for the Waitemata local board, we did have quite a strong, we had a number of submissions supporting a subdivision, say, for the city centre. But what we always said to our city centre residents is it's much better to have 7 people representing you than just 3 or 2. And so we always had a kaupapa that we were all there to represent all of the constituents of our local board area. So for that reason, the main reason that I won't be supporting this is the timing, the resources that will be involved, and I'm worried too that it'll probably tip Warwick into thinking of an early retirement, and we don't want to lose them if suddenly felt that this was going to be put on top of him as well. And we've also got, we don't know what's going to be coming from government, and that's probably going to put even more pressure on us. So thank you for the opportunity just to say a few words about why I won't be supporting this. But kia ora, and thank you, Councillor Sayers, for the work that's gone into this, the thinking behind it. Kia ora.
Thank you, Councillor Coombe. Councillor Christabi.
I've got an amendment by addition, Mayor, and I think the staff have just been conferring on it. So maybe you go to the next question or speaker, and then we'll come back to it.
Okay, let me just check. I've seen a copy of your amendment. It's not specifically on the topic, but it's wider than that. I think maybe I will take another speaker and then come back to you on that. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure. So I just want to speak in support of this. I think that what the community has come up with and what Councillor Sayers backs is well reasoned, and there's some analysis based on criteria particularly that go to community of interest. For my sins, I was a Rodney councillor for 10 years. I got elected immediately after the suspension, and like Councillor Watson, I was intimately familiar with it was actually the suspension of the council that happened at the time, and the reasoning behind that, and certainly Councillor Watson is right, it was because once you had the rural councillors and the Hibiscus Coast councillors in the same room without any division of responsibility, authority or accountability, it just didn't work. But just dealing with some of the issues here, as far as timing is concerned, I would suggest that far from the timing being poor, the timing is actually good, because it's not so far after the previous review when we looked at all of Auckland. So there's a strong argument, and I think Warwick would agree with me, that we don't actually have to visit many of the arguments that go to all of Auckland, the balance of Auckland, because they've been very recently traversed. But what we can do, and I'm sure the office time will be strongly focused, is in dealing on the matters before us as it goes to Rodney. For those of you that aren't familiar with the geography of the area, when I as a councillor had to travel from one part of Rodney to another, distant points, it might take me more than 2 hours driving time. Can you imagine that? Particularly if you had some congestion. I mean, it's 46% of the region, but not only that, it's incredibly disparate, separated. What this proposal does do, if you have a look at it and apply a perhaps a conflict lens over it, it means that the community of interest, particularly amongst the rural parts of Rodney, will tend to coalesce, because that big green area on the second map that Councillor Sayers presented covers most of that area, and it will give more effective representation to those rural parts of Rodney. And what may not be obvious to councillors that are in areas where you've got leisure centres and lots of community facilities and libraries and so on, if you look at this very large part of the region, many of those locations don't have any of those facilities. They don't even have sealed roads and the like. They don't have sewage. They don't have water. Obviously, people are still happy, but they're quite different. So I think that this proposal also has merit because it binds those communities together in rather a strong community of interest. So I think it's got real merit. I think the other comment that I'd make that we do have to consider going forward, and we don't do that sufficiently, is around the civic presence in parts of Auckland that are gradually losing it. And we need to revisit that, and this in part goes some way to doing that, because as Councillor Sayers and Councillor Watson have indicated, there are parts of Auckland that increasingly feel disenfranchised because of the emphasis on the centre rather than the emphasis on the parts, and the very strong history that this area has. So, in passing, I support this. I think that we owe it to the community. I don't think the costs are going to be great. I think that we can handle it strategically from a processing perspective.
Thank you very much. My suggestion is, after consulting on Councillor Darby's amendment, that we finish the discussion on the matter relating to Rodney Local Board, because this doesn't, it's much wider. But before we vote on the notice of motion, Councillor Darby might like to move this. While it's an amendment, it doesn't relate specifically to Rodney. So I kind of don't want to divert the debate off Rodney and then go back to Rodney. So, Councillor, if you're happy with that, we'll finish the debate on Rodney and then you can raise your notice of motion. I'm told we'd deal with it as a separate motion. I wasn't aware that you could do that, but I'm advised that you can. It's a surprise to me as well, but I'd rather do that. I'd rather just finish the debate on Rodney before dealing with this other matter. My advice is that we can deal with it as a separate motion. I'm not sure how that fits into standing orders, but I'm told that it does. And I'd just like to finish up the debate on Rodney specifically. So if that's okay with you, Councillor?
Yeah, look, just to be clear, it can be moved by amendment, by addition, or a separate motion, and I have conferred with Councillor Sayers on this because I don't want to weaken the emphasis on the notice of motion. So I'd actually like to take a lead from Councillor Sayers. If you don't mind, Councillor Sayers, would you like it by amendment, by addition, or do you want it as a separate motion afterwards?
My view is that it's quite separate from Rodney, and it's a different debate. And so I'm not wanting to close down the debate. Apparently you can have that debate, but I'd rather deal with Rodney in its own right first.
Point of order. Point of order, Mayor.
Point of order, Councillor Henderson.
Just in terms of 1.5.7 standing orders, amendments need to be relevant and not direct negatives. It must be relevant to the motion under discussion. So can I just seek a ruling on how relevant it is to the motion?
It might help if I read the motion. It's not a direct negative, but it is separate. You could say we're looking at reviewing one aspect, but actually we should review a much wider aspect. The motion from Councillor Darby is that the Chief Executive report back to the governing body in Q1 2021 on local government reforms signalled by government and scope to undertake a shared Auckland Council with government review of the decade-old legislation establishing Auckland Council, the Local Government Auckland Council Act 2009, that might inform local government reforms and refinements to the Auckland Council Act. What I have, so that's the motion. I'm sorry, I haven't had a chance to talk to Councillor Darby about that. It might be wise, before we do that, to find out exactly what is in the Minister's mind on what she intends to move and what she intends to put in the legislation. So if you were in agreement with it, I'm very happy to write to her, ring her, or otherwise communicate to say what is in this, and then this motion may be relevant if it is intended to be a wider one. If it's not intended to be a wider review, you might want to move at a particular point in time that we have a wider review, and we could do it then. I didn't know that there was an urgency about this, and it would be helpful to the debate on it to find out what the Minister was actually intending. But Councillor Darby, you might like to just respond to that suggestion.
Well, I need to be mindful of the standing orders. And Councillor Casey, I'd like you to withdraw the snoring, snorting noise. Yeah. That's the very behaviour that Councillor Hills highlighted publicly yesterday. It's not okay.
Hang on, look, I'm sorry, I'd rather not be...
I do take offence to that, members. Yeah. It is not at the scale of what Councillor Hills is referring to, but it's all part of that. It's not on.
I didn't hear what was alleged of the councillor, and she's not at the table now. So can I just ask you to refer to the suggestion that I've made to you, councillor, please?
What I'm referring to here is
Point of order, Your Worship.
Point of order, Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Your Worship. Look, in regards to standing orders and the relevancy that Councillor Henderson mentioned, do you have the decision-making to not allow this particular amendment because of its relevancy, because the relevancy itself has nothing to do with the notice of motion that we are discussing? My understanding of standing orders is that you as chair can refuse to accept this. So I just need a decision on that, please.
Mayor, I've actually
just to answer the point of order.
And it is relevant
Sorry,
to the motion.
Councillor Darby.
Councillor Darby, it's the point of order.
Were you wanting to speak to the point of order, Councillor Darby?
No, you can't speak to a point of order.
The answer to your point of order, councillor, is yes, I can rule it out of order. I'm trying to do this by agreement rather than by fiat from the chair. So, Councillor Darby, if I can get you just to come back to the question of whether you'd be willing to hold off on this until I can get clarification from the Minister as to what she's intending to do in the review of governance of Auckland Council.
Look, I've discussed this with Councillor Sayers, and I've also, it was triggered by a conversation a day that Councillor Dalton and I had yesterday, and Councillor Dalton is willing to second it. I do think it is entirely relevant because there is a broader review that the government has signalled, and I think that is an opportunity to capture the very things that Councillor Sayers has signalled here today. And I would be concerned that, because I'm getting a sense that there may not be a majority for Councillor Sayers' notice of motion to have the merit of what he's raising be entirely lost. The government has signalled in a briefing paper I've only just seen this morning that it intends to undertake local government reforms and review of the governance arrangements for Auckland. And yourself, your worship, you said in a recent media article, whole of council review would happen in due course. Let's be at the lead of that and have our chief executive do that work. And by all means, Mayor, you write to the minister, but it's the chief executive that works for us responding to resolution. And what I'm proposing is that we do some comprehensive work. It's 10 years, it's our birthday. Are we good? Are we bad? Have we succeeded? Not. How might that inform government's reforms? And the motion just asks the chief executives to start scoping things up, bring it back. It's entirely relevant to today. That's my explanation, not my speaking to.
Well, look, I'll make a ruling on it, and I'll rule that I won't accept the amendment because I don't think it's time-bound, Councillor. I understand that what you're asking for is a legitimate question, but I'd like, when we have the debate on this, to have the information first and foremost as to what the Minister is intending to do before we write to her asking for something that might be quite different from what she intends to do. There will be a chance to debate this in the future, but this I regard as a separate matter from the focus that we are trying to put on to the representation in the Rodney ward. So I'll rule in that direction.
Can you give me the reason for ruling it out, please? And we have that reason recorded, please?
Yes, I just have. This is not a time-bound amendment. We do have time to reconsider it, but we should reconsider it in the context of having the information we need as to what the Minister is intending to do, and that this motion is not integral and it's very marginal to the specific focus of the notice of motion in Councillor Sayers, that Councillor Sayers has put forward. That's the reason.
Is that the advice of the governance side of the council?
That's my advice, and it's my right to make that ruling.
Okay. Okay, look, I'll bring it as a notice of motion at the next governing body meeting because it was a request for the chief executive.
Councillor, you're entitled to do that, but we're not going to debate it now. Thank you very much. Councillor Chris, sorry. We are actually in the. Okay, look, I'm going to go through my speaking list now. So, Councillor Fletcher, it's your call.
Thank you, Your Worship. When Councillor Sayers asked me what I thought of his notice of motion, I went back and reviewed much of the work that we undertook at the time of the governance review, which you will see I voted against sections of it because I thought that the review we did at the time did a disservice to Auckland in that it was insufficiently adequate to address the failure within the Auckland amalgamation legislation. And while we spend a lot of time on the second floor of the town hall here, I know that there is a sense of dissatisfaction on some aspects of the legislation that we work from. Our speaker earlier today sort of spoke eloquently about, well, why not now? And it is, for me, a question of, if not now, why not? I think Auckland could be so much better. And we were grappling with frustrations amongst ourselves quite recently. And I think that so much of that is actually driven from the statute under which we work. And more refinement on that could create a much more workable Auckland. And after any major reform, you always go back and have a review and do some fine-tuning. And that is why I recorded my dissent. That, at the time I think I was a bit cheeky in the way that I put it. I likened it to turkeys and Christmas, which seems entirely appropriate today. But for all of those reasons, and I am a bit disappointed, but I welcome the fact that Councillor Darby has foreshadowed that he will be bringing forward a notice of motion. I do think with the arguments that have been put forward today by Councillor Sayers, quite compellingly, I will be supporting this notice of motion and will look forward to the notice of motion that is going to be brought forward by Councillor Darby. Auckland can do better, and we need to be leading government on what we want rather than waiting to be led and then being frustrated with the outcomes that we have. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Darby, you have a call. Do you wish to take the call on the motion?
Not right now,
in front of
thanks.
us? Right. So the last call is Councillor Newman.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I too would like to foreshadow to Councillor Darby when that draft notice of motion is prepared. Very happy to support that because I think that it is relevant to this conversation, given that the matter that has been proposed here by Councillor Sayers, if passed, triggers a representation review, which I think is actually quite fundamental and would be captured by what I think Councillor Darby is attempting to achieve here as part of a broader conversation about our governance arrangements. I did want to raise a question, but the time for questions has passed. But my question to Councillor Sayers actually is in relation to the wording in C, because understanding the intent of what the notice of motion would require, the outcome, if it is adopted, would be a requirement to have a broader representation review, including a representation review of the Rodney Local Board governance arrangements, and that would not exclude options beyond what has been proposed by the Northern Action Group. Now, I don't support what the Northern Action Group has proposed in terms of a refinement to subdivision boundaries. I do support a review, but then I want to consider other options, including the option of a Rodney at-large election in the Rodney Local Board area. The issue that I have if I vote for C is that I feel that even though, if passed, C is not going to limit us to that outcome, it would reflect my support for C, and actually I don't support changes only to subdivision boundaries as per the submission. So I wondered if the mover of the notice of motion would be prepared to amend C simply to reflect the fact that agree to a review of the Rodney Local Board representation arrangements for the 2022 elections, full stop. Because if that were the case, then I'm very, very comfortable with C. To me, I would say to the mover of the notice of motion that the fundamental problem that I have with the subdivision boundaries is the fact that it's very hard to address the issues of communities of interest as well as ensuring one vote, one value. And the only way, in my view, to address the one vote, one value issue is to remove subdivision boundaries full stop. And I would consider that not just for Rodney Local Board, but I consider the removal of subdivision boundaries within all local board areas. Because I think that that is, I think that the subdivision boundaries in Rodney are a bit of a country quota, and I understand the argument behind the subdivisions that were proposed in other areas of Auckland when the Auckland Council was established in 2009, 2010. But I think times have changed, and I think the representation arrangements ought to reflect that. The chair of the Rodney Local Board has identified that members elected to the Rodney Local Board are interested and concerned and are stewards for all parts of Rodney, as they should be. They're not elected to just be a representative for that area. They're elected to be representatives of the Rodney community, and they vote on all matters relating to that community. Actually, it's an argument for considering issues such as whether we should have ward boundaries or whether we should have councils elected at large. So I'm happy to have this review, but I'm not happy with the being locked into just the issue that has been proposed, the solution that has been proposed in C. So maybe in the right of reply, the mover of the notice of motion might want to reflect on that, because if we have this, we will go wider than just this proposal, which is the appropriate thing to do. I would imagine that we would confirm within the Auckland region for the moment, actually the representation for the existing wards and local board areas would remain the same, but with the likely exception being Rodney and I suspect Howick, and that we would need to have a broad consideration of these matters, and then it would come back for debate, because I'm sure we'd have objections, and then we can resolve a proposal for the Local Government Commission, which we did last time, which I think was pretty thorough. We addressed some pretty controversial issues last time. You remember, Your Worship? I mean, I remember a proposal to split a ward, but we can address these matters, but I would like some consideration by the mover of the notice of motion, because I don't want to vote to reflect the wording in C at the moment, which actually I specifically oppose, but I am happy to support a review, which would be triggered if we were to pass this notice of motion today.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Sayers might like to consider that before his right of reply. Councillor Darby, you were wanting to take the call.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I do want to acknowledge Councillor Sayers for taking the lead and actually representing what he's picking up from his community as a significant issue. And I think the lead is what I'd like to emphasise here, Councillor Sayers. Having said that, I won't be mealy-mouthed with you, Councillor Sayers. I can't support this in isolation because there are knock-on effects, and I think you know those occur. So that's why I was working with you on a more holistic understanding of things all Auckland. That the government has signalled, but look, I've covered that, and that's been knocked out by the Mayor, but I have heard quite a lot of interest in that, so I do signal my notice of motion, and while Councillor Dalton and I might just put our names to that, I think I'll circulate that and give every member around this table the opportunity to have their notice of motion on a wider review, even though it might have Councillor Dalton and my name as the mover and seconder. But I'll go into that another time. But Councillor Sayers, what you've done here today is you've helped trigger probably a discussion that we should have had some time ago, that inquiry as to how good has the legislation been for Auckland. And while we might laud ourselves with all the highlights, we probably don't honestly or haven't honestly gone back to the Royal Commission work and looked at the two systemic problems that were identified, lack of regional integration, community engagement being poor. And I think the crux of your issue is actually likely, the inquiry needs to be undertaken, is about community engagement. It's about representation. And so that distills down to the depth and meaningfulness of our community engagement. And that is one of the key systemic issues that Justice Salmon identified more than 10 years ago. So thank you for triggering this, and I think we can start this journey now together, and your influence from Rodney can reach right across Auckland as we maybe work with government in a shared way, not just be led by them, that we work with them to review the legislation and have a better, improved governance structure for the whole of Auckland going forward, and they can also learn from Auckland's successes or otherwise to help inform their legislation as it applies to local government reforms around the country.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I have no other calls, so I'm going to take a call and then ask Councillor Sayers to have his right of reply. Firstly, I just want to address the question that the last speaker has raised. A wider review of our governance structures is an important issue. And if we were to make that decision, which is a valid decision to make if we choose to do so, we should make that decision in its own right, not as a tag-on to a specific issue that we're dealing with today, which is Rodney. If we make that decision, of course, that would involve, I think, Mr. Chief Executive, quite an enormous amount of resources. We've just got to think of what the CCO review, which was an effective review and one that I initiated, we know that took a lot of resources. It may be that we want to go in that direction, but if we want to go in that direction, we won't do it as a tag-on to another motion. We'll do it in its own right with proper consideration and facts in front of us, including what the Minister herself is intending in her review. That's not to say that we can't go for a review, but if it's in her mind that she doesn't want to do a review of that nature, we can do a review ourselves, perfectly within our capability. So it's not a case of needing their permission. We can do it, and we can do it independently. And I'd actually rather do it independently than do it with the government deciding whether or not we should be structurally reviewed. This is our decision to make about our future, not the government's decision. Can I come back to Councillor Sayer's resolution? And I want to thank him for raising it on behalf of the Northern Action Group, and I want to thank him for giving us due notice so that we all had a chance to think about this, and our officers had a chance to present a case. And his recommendations, his notice of motion, does raise a really interesting issue, and that is, what is a community of interest? Because it's not defined. It's not defined, actually, I think, even for electorates at central government level, and it's an amorphous sort of thing. I live in a ward very similar to Councillor Sayers. I'm just not sure whether Ardmore would want to be lumped in with the Awhitu Peninsula, because we're both rural and create a very large area, and whether our community of interest isn't in fact with Clevedon, because that's the local the town centre for us. My feeling is probably we've worked on the basis of a place-based definition of community of interest, and I would need to be convinced that we should move away from that, and I'm not at this moment convinced. But there are other things, and the things raised by our officers. We just had a review back in February, and we passed a resolution, I think maybe it was unanimous, I don't know, that we don't take further action. Sorry, it was overwhelming rather than unanimous. And I really think that the advice that we've been given, that you can't limit the review if it takes place. You can't do a partial review, because anybody across our whole electorate can say, actually, if you're having a review of representation, I want this for Howick because we've exceeded the margin, the plus or minus 10% size or whatever. So I think if we are going to have a review, we would have to be prepared to have a review that covered much wider issues, and I'm not sure why we would do that within a year of deciding we didn't need a review. It could well be that we have to have a review because other changes external to this council are taking place, and that includes the Minister's indication and the Department of Internal Affairs indication that the way in which we are limited in the size of our representation, contrary to everywhere else in the country, should be changed, and there may be changes in Maori representation. I think if we're going to have a review, I don't want to have one review that we decided earlier this year, another review on this issue, and then a further review next year or the year after. Let's see what comes out of what the government is proposing on those specific issues I've talked about, and then it may well be that we bring forward our review, but we do it all together. I think those are probably the major arguments. I respect the right of the local councillor to raise this recommendation. I acknowledge the presentation that we had both from the representative from the Northern Action Group, but also from the chair of the local board. And I have received correspondence, I think everybody's received correspondence, that suggests that this is not an idea that is universally applauded. I don't know where the balance of views are on it, but I think probably I've had 4 letters, and other councillors will have, from members of the Rodney local board and from groups such as Snell's Beach, and it suggests that this may not be something that the ward is unanimously looking for, but it's a matter of contention between different groups with different interests. So at this point, my approach will be not to support the recommendation, with due respect to the local ward councillor, for the reasons that I've set out. But I'd now like to pass to Councillor Greg Sayers the right of reply. Thank you, Councillor.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Mayor, and thank you for your comments. I would like to reflect on comments from Councillor Darby and also from Councillor Newman in my reply. Obviously, the Mayor's made his ruling, Councillor Darby. I couldn't add your recommendation as on my amendment. I understand you had a second. I didn't want to lose this right of reply. I hope you understand that, but I'm pleased you've foreshadowed your notice of motion and duly noted by myself. In terms of Councillor Newman, yes, look, if I'll put this to the division, so I'm happy to end the C after the words 2022 elections. My understanding that probably gives you some flexibility in terms of what you'd like to present at that opportunity, but it doesn't exclude what's been presented today. So if I could do that with the indulgence of my seconder. Yeah. Just
on a point of order, Councillor, that has to be, obviously your seconder has to agree, but it has to be with the agreement of the meeting as a whole too. It doesn't have to be unanimous, but if there is a call for a division on that change, I would have to accept it.
All right, okay. Well, I don't know who makes that call, but I'm happy to make the change, Mr Mayor.
Maybe I just clarify this matter now. I'm sorry to interrupt your right of reply. Is there anybody that is opposed to or would wish to have a division on the change that's been foreshadowed by the mover of the amendment? Well, we'll make that amendment accordingly. Thank you, Councillor.
Okay, well done, Mr Chair.
Just asked if you wanted a division. You didn't ask to vote. You didn't ask for the agreement. My understanding for the agreement to the change. You just said, did we want a division on it?
It doesn't have to be unanimous, but if somebody wanted to have a vote on it, the decision by the majority of the councillors would prevail.
Sorry, I didn't hear you put the vote.
No, I didn't, because I asked if anybody had any problem with the amendment.
No, I do. No, I do. And all I heard you say is, do you want a division? Which I didn't, but.
Okay, so. No, that's fine. I was just trying to get a sense of whether there was a majority of people against it. I'd rather not have a division if we don't need it. So I understand.
That's all.
Yep, no, that's fine. So some people will be opposed, but nobody has asked for it to be put to the vote. So that amendment will be made accordingly. Thank you, Councillor. Please resume your right of reply, and sorry to interrupting.
No, that's quite all right, Your Worship. That's due process and correct procedure, so I thank you for that. I do want to compliment our officers, Warwick McMorton, supported by Rose, in terms of the response that they've given to the paper and the way they've professionally presented their thoughts to us as the governing body. So thank you very much, Warwick and Rose, for that. I think that was helpful, and in many ways complementary, I think, to the efforts and the innovation, I think the word that you used around the proposal. I do want to acknowledge the work that was put in by the Northern Action Group. I think we've all read the paper. There's a lot of technical effort that's gone into it. So to Mr Bill Foster, well done, sir. Quite an incredible effort, and I've been proud to support this notice of motion. I also want to thank you, Mr Chair, for accepting the notice of motion through your Chief Executive. Also want to thank the effort made by the local board chair, Phelan Perry, to come down here and make comment to us to help us in our decision making. Also want to thank all the councillors around this table for the questions and comments, ladies and gentlemen, that you've made today in this debate. In my presentation, I tried to explain, I appreciate your point, Mr Mayor, about what is a community of interest. So that's why I went to a little bit of trouble to explain how I saw it for the Rodney local board areas by going through those different subdivisions of Warkworth, Dairy Flat, Kimu and the rural area. Now, I am going to ask for support in getting this resolution passed, probably through a division, because I think we actually have, having listened to the debate, each of us has to decide, one, is there merit in the ideology? Is there merit in going to the public to get feedback? It could be rejection or it could be modification of the proposal. But as the governors of Auckland, I believe we have that duty of care to do that. And therefore, that's why I'm asking you for your support today. It's expressing the democratic rights of people, both in townships and in the rural areas, to exercise their democratic right to have the fairest, the most balanced, and the most equitable model of political representation in place for them as soon as possible. And that's where I probably disagree with some of the counter debate to this motion today. We should not be delaying. We should be getting on to give those people the fairness, the balance, and the equity that we so often talk around this table. Well, today is a chance to make a difference. Why not in February? I think we've had that answered. The idea wasn't formulated in February by this group, and that's why it's been presented to you today. Embracing the opportunity to do is that 1 minute?
Yeah, take another minute to round off. Thanks, Councillor.
Thank you. This is about taking the opportunity to honour the people of Rodney. I think this is hard to vote against. It's good ideology. It's like the LTP. No decision's been made today, but we seem quite happy to go out in the LTP and consult on it. Well, what I'm asking for you is to do the same today. I don't believe we can wait any longer, and that we have a duty to act now, Your Worship. So in closing, I would just ask that this is presented by division. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Just because it's a day of complications, apparently, I've been advised that the amendment to C would leave a resolution that is beyond our power to move, and I'm going to ask for comment on that from our lawyers, so that the advice that I've just received, I'm sorry, I have just received it, is that we either go with the original proposition or we rule out C altogether. But can I get you to speak to that, please?
Thank you. Through the Chair. So the advice that Warwick provided to the members was that in order to undertake a review, it would need to be a full representation review. So C would need to be agreed to review as part of a full representation review, the subdivision boundaries of the Rodney Local Board area for the 2022 elections.
So just to seek clarification of that, is the original C also out of order?
Yes.
Okay. It's better to have the advice late than not to have it at all. Thank you. So you'll all see the dilemma that this creates, including Councillor Sayers. What we'd be effectively voting on is A and B, but we don't have a C, and I'd have to say that perhaps we should have got the advice much earlier, before the debate began, that that C in its original form was not in order either. But that is the advice that we have now received. Warwick, would you like to add anything to that?
Just a suggestion to change, a minor change to the wording. Take out the word only. Agree to review and resolve changes to the subdivision boundaries of the Rodney Local Board area for the 2022 elections as part of a review of representation arrangements.
Okay, I'm going to have to check with the. I'll come to you in just a moment, Councillor Newman. I'll have to check with the mover and the seconder that they're happy to do that. I presume they are, rather than lose it. But you have a question also, Councillor Newman.
Yes, I do. A question to the officer. because I support the review and I'm undecided on a resolution of changes. So I would assume that we would need to agree a review of the subdivision boundaries for the Rodney Local Board area for the 2022 elections, but there's no requirement as part of this resolution to resolve changes today, is there? That would simply be a matter for the review, which would require the consultation and future deliberation before an agreement by the governing body to put that proposal to the Local Government Commission.
It would make it clearer if we actually took out the words relating to resolve, so that there isn't a resolution right now to make a change. Agreed to review changes to the subdivision boundaries of the Rodney Local Board area for the 2022 election as part of a wider review of representation arrangements.
Okay, now I want to put that up before everybody has is asked to vote on it. You've asked for a division too, Councillor, but are you and your seconder in agreement with the changes recommended by our officers?
Well, I am, Mr Chair. If we could just see the wording up there so we could all just digest it.
Okay, we'll put it up, but maybe you can just repeat that again, Warwick, so everybody can absorb what the change is.
Agree to review changes to the subdivision boundaries of the Rodney Local Board area for the 2022 elections as part of a wider review of representation arrangements.
Okay, is everybody ready? Oh, sorry, Councillor Cooper.
I had a question.
A question, Councillor Cooper.
And if you don't mind, it's to you, Warwick. Right at the beginning of the questions, I asked you if doing just Rodney would trigger a review of all subdivisions in the whole region, and it would require it. Is that, and you said yes. Is that correct?
Yeah, sorry for any confusion. I did try to start off by saying it's not possible to do a partial review.
That's right. So we knew that right at the beginning. So the other question you were asked before, which is really critical for me, is we didn't have time to do this by August when it would be needed.
In terms of timing, I set out in the memo of the process we used last time. We started from memory about February, worked through the Joint Governance Working Party, looking at the different proposals and changes that could be made, went out to local boards and reported all of that back by July. It would be quite constrained, I think, but it's possible.
Okay, I think we've got at least some clarity, and I'm sorry that it's come late, that what we'd then be voting on, and as agreed by the mover and the seconder, is that you would do the review of Rodney for the 2022 elections, but it would be as part of a wider review of representation arrangements. So this would be another full-blown review. Okay, so I think, not sure whether that will change people's views on it, but I'm going to ask officers now to put this to a vote by division, please.
Councillors, you're voting on the motion as you see it on screen. Mayor Goff.
Sorry, the division is on A, B and C, or is it A, B and C separately?
No, it's there's no request to have divided the resolution. You're voting on A, B and C. They all run together.
Okay, can we have a division on the A and the B then, because one is a noting motion.
Just a point of order, could I just, Your Worship, we had already started that process, so just for clarity, please, we'd already started, so do we not now need to continue on A, B and C? Because we had already started.
Councillor, you're quite right. The process has begun, and I think A is noting, so if you took it separately, why would anybody vote against it? What you're actually voting on is the B and C, but they all run together. So I think we'll go back to holding the division and ask officers to recommence the vote on the division.
Mayor Goff.
No.
Deputy Mayor Cashmore,
No.
Councillor Collins,
Against.
Councillor Coombe,
Against.
Councillor Cooper, Councillor Dalton,
Against.
Councillor Darby,
Against, but record support for A and B, please.
Councillor Filipaina,
Against.
Councillor Fletcher, Councillor Henderson,
Against.
Councillor Hills,
Against.
Councillor Mulholland,
Against.
Councillor Newman,
For.
Councillor Sayers,
For.
Councillor Simpson,
Against.
Councillor Stewart,
For.
Councillor Walker, Councillor Watson,
For.
Councillor Young.
For.
So that is lost 7 votes to 12.
So I declare the notice of motion lost by 7 votes to 12. Right. It's 11:55. I think we'll see if we can continue to make progress, unless you feel a desperate need to have a cup of tea. Let's deal with item number 11, the Auckland War Memorial Museum Q1 report. And if I could ask Edward Siddle
Your
and...
Worship, just a point of clarification. When is it your intention, I would like to use the bathroom, when is it your intention to take a very brief break?
I just needed an indication of that, Councillor. We'll call a 5-minute break and then resume. Please, if we can make it in 5 minutes, that's at 12:01 precisely. Thank you.